Likutei Sichos, Chelik Yutes, Volume 19, the first Sicha for Elul. This Sicha will describe the essence or the objectives of the month of Elul, and also tell us from where we draw the resources, the potential of being able to properly affect and implement the purpose of Elul. As an introduction, there are two verses, familiar verses, in Shir Hashirim, in the Song of Songs written by Shlomo HaMelech, describing the relationship between us, the Jewish people, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem. One says, Doidi li va'ani loi. My beloved is to me, and I am to him. And the other one says, which is very familiar, especially as it comes to the month of Elul, which happens to be the acronym of the word Elul, Ani lidoidi v'doidi li. I am to my beloved, and my beloved is to me. Now in Chassidus it's explained that doidi li v'ani loi, that my beloved is to me and I am to him. This describes the relationship that comes about milmaila lemata, literally translated from above down, meaning one that's triggered from above, and then it affects the lower elements, us. Whereas ani lidoidi v'doidi li describes the avoida, the mode of connection to Hashem, of service to Hashem, which is milmato lemaila, coming from below, going upwards, then triggering the above. Or in other words, as in using terminology of Kabbalah and Chassidus, this is the isarusa de la'ela versus the isarusa de latato. Isarusa means an awakening, an arousal, de la'ela from above. And then there is the one, the isarusa, the latata, the awakening, the arousal that comes from below. Sometimes you have first an isarusa de la'ela, which triggers an arousal and awakening in us, and sometimes vice versa, that you have an awakening, an arousal that comes from the person, and that, so to speak, triggers an awakening, a desire in Hashem. Another thing that will be useful in this sikha, the Chassidus, without going into detail, explains that there are different levels. The basic level that we know is called oir, light, which means, so to speak, like a light that shines, that is something that you can see almost, that's something that has an effect, a direct effect on the lower elements. And then a level higher is called ruach, which is spirit, like in the sense of something which is spiritual. You don't really see it. It's there, but you don't see it. So let's get into the sikha. In one of the talks of the previous Rebbe, from Chag HaPesach, from the festival of Pesach, in the year Tov Reish Tzadik Daled, which is 1924, he describes the spiritual situation, the spiritual state of matters that took place in the, quote, capital city of Chabad, which for many, many years was the capital city. This was the base, aka Lubavitch, in the town of Lubavitch, in the time when Shabbos Mevorchim, Chodesh Elul, the Shabbos in which we usher in and we bless the month of Elul, came about. And this is how he describes it. I'll try to present it almost verbatim. So he says, the Shabbos Mevorchim Chodesh Elul, Hagam means although, es fleck noch sein, a klor zun shine diker tag, even though it was a clear day of sunshine, it was a clear sunshine day, hat sich schon der Avir gebitten. But the atmosphere, the air, already had changed. As such a ungeheben feeling the Elul. Already one can start to feel the scent of Elul. As hat sich geblosen atshuvavind. There started to like a blast of wind of tshuva, or a breeze of tshuva started to blow. So says the Rebbe, all talks and words, even specific words, of our Rabbeim are very exact, very accurate, very detailed. And therefore, these four things, he breaks it out into four different stanzas, so to speak. Sunshine, the change of the air, the scent of Elul, and then the blowing of a tshuva breeze. All these things are not just nice euphemisms, but it must be that they all express the inner essence, the inner idea, the purpose, the point of the month of Elul. And moreover, says the Rebbe, not only the actual words, what they said, is very exact and accurate and has a meaning, but also when it was said, because everything by the Rabbeim was exact. Everything was accounted for. So the fact that the Rebbe chose to say this, to describe what Elul, Shabbos Mevarchim Elul, looked like in Lubavitch, and he chose to describe it in a Sicha, in a talk on the festival of Pesach, is also telling in itself, also has to have a lot of meaning. And the question is, what is it? Because if you think about it, the idea of Pesach and the idea of Elul are actually opposite. Because Pesach, we know, is represented in that verse that I brought in that I introduced in the introduction, Doidi li vani loi. As the Alter Rebbe explains at length in Likutei, that what happened by the miracle of Yetzias Mitzrayim was all in a manner of Isarusa de La'ela. It all came from above. Hashem acted in a manner where He so to speak, shined His light on us. He made the awakening came from above. It was nothing on our accord. In fact, the way the Gemara describes it, the way it's described in the Talmud, we were not deserving of it. And we were in no way ready and prepared for it. It was something that was, so to speak, showered down on us from above. However, Elul, as we see in the acronym of the word, Ani lidoidi, that first I am to my beloved, we have to do something. We have to, so to speak, get off our seat and actually do something in order to trigger vidoidi li, that Hashem should also, so to speak, respond to us. So the question is, why would the Rebbe say this Sicha? Why would he talk about Elul in the month of Pesach, in the festival of Pesach? So the explanation is as follows. We know there's a verse in the book of Eov, the book of Job, that says, Mi hikdimani v'hashalim. Hashem says, so to speak, who can confront me? Meaning, who has, so to speak, preceded me, done something, and that he can now confront me and say, look what I did, and I'll go and I'm ready to pay him. And then Hashem continues and he says, Tachas kol hashamayim, everything under the heaven is mine. That means this is also referring to simply when somebody gives tzedakah. Somebody shouldn't think that it's just coming from his money. Who gave you the money? Where you have these resources from which you can now do the mitzvah. In other words, everything comes from Hashem. So therefore, what's understood over here, that even what a Yid affects through his avodah, through his service of Hashem, even this is something that comes from the koyach, from the potential, from the resources that he receives from above in order to be able to do it. Of course, you get credit, not to take away just as a side note, this is not to say that a Jew doesn't get the credit for it, because the fact is you took the initiative to take advantage of this, to dip into these resources. But the fact is the resource for it, the ability to be able to do your avodah, which later will garnish your, so to speak, attention from Hashem, that in itself comes from Hashem. That is not something that's your own doing. So now, what happens in the month of Elul? We see this idea in the month of Elul. The Alter Rebbe describes in a parable that in the month of Elul, the king is, quote, in the field. HaMelech Basada, quote, the king is in the field. And then he describes how each and every person now has the ability to approach the king, to get close to the king. In other words, what is this telling us? That although the month of Elul requires the avodah of the person, as we said, ani lidoidi, we have to do something, we have to take the initiative. Yet, where do we get the ability? Where do we have the power, the potential to do this, to this avodah, to trigger, so to speak, the doidi li? Where do we have the ability of ani lidoidi? This comes because, as the Alter Rebbe explains, the 13 attributes of mercy are shining in full glow, in full force, during the month of Elul. So it's understood, says the Rebbe, that now, once there is an isarusa de latato, an awakening from below, meaning once we have our avodah in the month of Elul, which now will trigger, because every arousal, every awakening triggers a counter awakening. So when you have an isarusa de latato, it's going to trigger an isarusa de le'ela. It's obvious that this isarusa de le'ela, the quote doidi li, which is triggered through the sarusa de latata, the quote anila doidi, is obviously much higher and much greater than the initial isarusa de laela, the dormant one, or so to speak, the hidden one, which gave us the ability to do our part. Why is that obvious? Because that one did not come, so to speak, in any earned manner. It just came from above. It came as pure kindness from Hashem that He gives us the ability. It's almost like a free handout. Whereas when we're getting an Isarusa de La'ela, which comes after our Isarusa de Latata, that obviously is much greater, it's much more valuable. But still, bottom line, to summarize, where do we get the ability? From where do we have the koyach, the potential of being able to trigger the avodah, being able to have a sarusa de latata in order to have the ani ledoidi? That comes from the isarusa de la'ela, the initial one that comes from Hashem. Now, the general time for isarusa de la'ela of the year, there's always the isarusa de la'ela comes in particular times. But the general allocation, so to speak, for the general time of the year, that comes from from the festival of Pesach, for Chag HaPesach. Because Chag HaPesach in general, as you mentioned before, is inherently the idea of Isarusa de La'ela, things that get triggered from above. And therefore, that Isarusa de Latata, that Isarusa de La'ela, which triggers Isarusa de Latata, that we have the ability to do our avodah in the month of Elul, that is trickled down from where? From the main spurt, so to speak, of Isarusa de La'ela, which came in the festival of Pesach. And that explains why this Sicha was said specifically on Pesach about Shabbos Mevarchim, which ushers in and therefore brings in a general sense, all the points, all the essence, the idea of the month of Elul. And now we can go into the 4 specific expressions that the Rebbe says, the 4 details in the talk of the Rebbe. First, he starts off with the sunshine. Sunshine, what is it? It is something that comes from above. It is not something that's triggered from below. This is something which Hashem shines down, so to speak. And that expresses the idea of that initial Isarusa de La'ela. Then he describes the effect that this has on the people. That what? That first they feel the scent of Elul, and then that there is a breeze, a wind of tshuva blowing. What is this idea of scent? What is this idea of scent and breeze? What does this mean? How does this get expressed in a spiritual sense? The Alter Rebbe explains that the main purpose, the main objective of tshuva is that v'haruach toshuv el Elokim asher nasana. He quotes a pasuk from Koheles, from Shlomo HaMelech, that says, quote, the ruach, the spirit, shall return to the God which gave it. Which is basically that the person has to elevate himself to the level of ruach, beyond the level of oil. It means a person has to elevate himself to something higher, to the spirit, as we said in the introduction, that there is a difference between ruach and oil, which we're commonly accustomed to. And this is what he's hinting to when he says that there was a ruach, there was a breeze, there was a wind, hinting to this, quote, spirit that one has to elevate himself to. Now, what is this thing about the reyach, about the scent? What is this thing about scent? Well, because ultimately, what is really the purpose of tshuva? What is really the objective of tshuva? Tshuva is to bring us to the point of the redemption, the point of Mashiach. Now, Mashiach is associated with the idea of scent, and is defined by it, as it says in Yeshayahu. In Yeshayahu, chapter 11, verse 3, over there he describes Mashiach, and he says, "V'haricha b'yiras Hashem," that he shall sense the truth by having a scent, so to speak, of fear of God. And the Gemara says that the Mashiach will smell and judge properly. When it came to the story of Bar Kochba, how did they know that he was not the right Mashiach after having thought that he was? Because they sensed that he does not have this special trait of Moirach Vadoyin, of being able to sense the truth, to smell. That means having a proper sense. So therefore, the Rebbe brings this idea of scent because that is the ultimate purpose, the ultimate goal, the ultimate destination, so to speak, of what Tshuva is supposed to lead to. The idea of Mashiach, which is encapsulated in the idea of Reyach, of scent. And as an introduction to that, he says, quote, that the avir, that the air in Lubavitch, the air already had begun to change. Why does he use this term of air? So the Rebbe says when we look at the life of a person, basically you see all the necessities, the things that a person must have in order to survive, in order to live a proper life. And if you go down, you start from the least essential to the most essential. You go from the least essential, you go first, housing, shelter, having a place to live. More essential is clothing. Even more essential is food. Even more essential is water. And then the most essential is air to breathe, which is something which is so constant. It's not something like any of the other things that you can either live without or live without momentarily or temporarily. Somebody cannot have food or drink and survive for a long time, but there's only very little time that you can survive without air to breathe. And since a person must breathe all the time, and it's something that one feels, and it's something that comes about easily, it comes about naturally. It's something that is just there. You don't have to really make any effort to breathe, unless chas v'shalom something is wrong. Therefore, he describes this breeze, this air, and this scent of Elul, that it's something that already is in the air, that the air changed. With this, the Rebbe is stressing, the previous Rebbe is stressing, that it's, quote, in the air. And it's something that is coming naturally and automatically to each and every one, even without effort. And that every single soul, every single neshama can tap into this wonderful and amazing, these amazing qualities of the month of Elul.